Hi, Geometry. This is Unit 1, Lesson 12, and this is Translations. And this will be glued on the page after page 89. So if you're at home, you could always flip to the blank page after page 89 and do these steps directly on the page. You can take a moment and pause this video and draw a triangle DEC very similar to this one and this vector here. So first of all, before we do this translation, I want to talk about this directed line segment V. So this is called a directed line segment. You also might see it called a vector. So you could call this vector V, or our book calls it a directed line segment. This line segment has both distance and it has direction. So basically, I want to take this entire triangle that you see here, and I want to move it exactly this far away, and I want to move it exactly this direction. So I don't want it to wind up here, which would be going upwards. I don't want my triangle to wind up back here, which would be going this direction. I want to follow this arrow tells me my direction, and the distance of this arrow tells me the distance that I want to move my triangle. So let's start by doing step one. My step one for this is I'm going to measure my vector. So from the front of my vector V, or my directed line segment V, I'm going to measure from the back all the way to the front arrow. So I'm going to put my needle on the back, and I'm going to put my pencil then on the arrow in front. I'm going to get this total distance. So my next step after I do that, my step 2, is to mark this distance at, and I could pick any of my 3 points. I'm going to start at C. We'll go alphabetically. So I'm going to move my needle to C, and I'm going to mark an arc that is this distance away. So this distance is what's all along this arc. My C prime is somewhere on this arc. I don't know where it is yet, but C prime will be in this arc. So step 3, what I just did there was the distance. I've measured how far away C prime should be. So step 3 is where I'm going to do the direction. I'm going to measure, sorry about that, measure from the back of vector V to my C. And then I'm going to mark that distance at the front. I'm going to put arrow in parentheses, arrow, front of the vector. So I want to move parallel to this vector. I want to move parallel. I want to make my distance this direction. So this is going to help me get the direction. This step 2 is how I got the distance. This step is how I'm getting my direction correct. So let's do this. I'm going to now measure from C to the back of my vector. So I'm going to have to make this a little bit smaller. So I put my arrow on the back of my vector, my needle, on the back of my vector, and my pencil on C. This is how far C is from the back of my vector. C prime should be that exact distance from the front. So I'm going to measure from the back of the vector to C. That's this distance right here. Then I'm going to mark that distance at the front. That's the arrow of the vector. So C is this far from the back. C prime will be that same distance from the front. So now this is my C prime. That's where my distance and my direction arcs intersected. So let's do the same thing for E. I'm going to replace this with E. So first let's measure my vector V So I'm going to measure from the back of it all the way to the front. And I'm going to mark this distance at E. So this is my E. So I'm going to mark this distance out here with a nice big arc. So that's step 2. Step 3, I'm going to measure from the back of the vector to E. So let's put my needle on the back and make it smaller, and my pencil on E. Feel free to pause this video so if you need to catch up. And then I'm going to mark this distance at the front of the vector, at the arrow. So I'm going to take my needle and move it from the back to the front, and I'm going to mark this distance. Where those two arcs just intersected, this is my E prime. If you're finding your arcs aren't intersecting, you're not making them long enough. You are going to have to redo your arcs, making them long enough that they intersect. So now you have 2 options for D prime. I do these 2 steps because I find them quick and easy. Once you get used to it, it goes very fast. You could use the distance from C to make an arc for D prime. You could use the distance from E to make an arc for D prime. Where they intersect is your D prime. We did something similar when we did reflections. But I'm going to keep this. It goes quick enough. I'm going to measure my vector B, but both methods work great. Whatever is your preference. So I'm going to measure the distance of my vector. I'm going to mark that distance at D. So I'm going to have this arc. Next, I'm going to measure from the back of the vector to D. So needle on the back, I'm going to measure to D. And now I'm going to go mark this distance at the front of the vector, at the arrow. So I'm going to move forward with my needle on the arrow, and I'm going to mark this distance. So this is my D prime. So now I'm going to connect those 3. And when I do that, this is my triangle translated along vector V. So now I want to talk about this translation a little bit. Let me get a different colored pen. I want you to see the directed line segment, the vector. I want you to see V in this diagram. So please do this with a different color as well, because this is actually complete. This is finished. E prime, C prime, D prime would be my answer. That is my image after this translation. But let's connect D to D prime, put an arrow at D prime. So I'm going to connect D to D prime, and I'm going to put an arrow here. Let's connect C to C prime, and let's put an arrow. And let's connect E to E prime, and let's put an arrow. What I wanted you to see here about this translation, I wanted you to see these blue lines. They match vector V, directed line segment V. They are the same distance. So if I measure this, you're going to find that they are all the same distance. So E is that distance away from, or E prime is that distance away from E.